Thomas Cahill is head of the Delta Group, scientists who monitor air pollution worldwide. He was a lead investigator of the pollutants produced by 9/11. The conventional wisdom is that the most toxic air from 9/11 was in these dust clouds. But in studying the dust, Cahill made a startling discovery.
To our surprise and amazement, it turned out the material was mostly drywall, mostly gypsum, which in fact is harmless.
But in the weeks that followed, the air at Ground Zero got much worse as workers cleaned up the site.
The coarse products contained very finely powdered cement, and that cement had very caustic chemical composition. And so what it did was it burned the back of your nose, your throat, and your bronchotract.
As bad as these particles were, there was far worse material in the air. Invisible pollutants called ultrafine particles produced by the burning rubble pile.
Ultrafine particles are particles smaller than 0.1 micrometer in diameter, which is about 1,000 to 2,000 times finer than a human hair.
These particles were the vaporized metals of tens of thousands of computers from the buildings. Over 3 months, the metals burned and condensed into ultrafine flecks that were breathed in by workers at the site. Imagery from a transmission electron microscope reveals for the first time the three-dimensional structure of these particles.
Ultrafine particles are so tiny that they evade our body's normal defenses.
Our breathing system has a series of filters to keep particles out. Coarse particles are caught in our noses and throats. Medium-sized particles get trapped in the bronchial tubes. But ultrafine pollutants make it past our defenses and deep into our lungs. This invisible matter is so minute, it may not affect our lungs at all, but it could damage us in other ways.
When it's in the deep lung, it has the possibility of going through the lining into your bloodstream. So the very finest particles will get into your deep lung and your bloodstream and eventually your heart. And it appears the problem is not that they're toxic per se, but they get into the system and it's looked as though it's an invading microbe or something. The body overreacts to it. When the ultrafine particles, metals especially, work their way into the heart, they get encapsulated and they become part of the heart tissue. And the heart is sort of aged by these metals. And the heart gets larger and weaker.
Ground Zero was the worst case of ultrafine pollution that Cahill ever encountered. Yet the workers had no idea they were facing this invisible danger, since they'd been told the air was safe to breathe.
When we saw the people at the site running around with no respirators or these little useless paper masks, this made me feel very worried, because we knew then there were ultrafine particles in the atmosphere would go right through those masks.
Cahill thinks that in coming years there'll be another wave of illness in the Ground Zero workers.
We expect people to see heart attacks at ages much younger than would normally be expected. That working from the pile for about a month would be worth probably a decade or more of working in even rather poor urban conditions. So they've been aged by at least a decade, maybe much more.
But this kind of pollution is not limited to Ground Zero. Cahill's group has found that unseen ultrafine particles pose a widespread threat. This material floats in the air that you breathe.
We're located here on top of a freeway bridge above Interstate 80 to measure the ultrafine particles coming from cars and diesels.
Using air samplers, Cahill's team has been gathering evidence. Plastic strips, which are analyzed in a lab.
We've examined the composition of the particles from cars and trucks, and we find several things that really cause us concern. One is metals. We see things like zinc, which is a contaminant in the lubricating oil that burns. We also discovered chemicals like benzoate pyrene, which is a known carcinogen.
But there are no environmental standards for ultrafine particles. These are 25 times smaller than the particulates that regulators do look at.
We know where ultrafine particles go. We know what they do to the heart now. And yet the measurements being made by the state and federal agencies do not address these particles directly. They're not measuring them.
Armed with his research, Cahill is now urging environmental agencies to take action.
My interest in the invisible world is largely because the particles in the invisible world are so dangerous. The invisible particles for us are part of a major health threat, and we want to do everything possible to get them out of the air.
But ultrafine particles aren't the only hidden menace in the atmosphere.